This is a review for PC 10. It's all about perfect square trinomials. These are a type of quadratic, so we start with the general form ax squared plus bx plus c. And if these conditions are true, that our c value is equal to b divided by 2 squared, it's called a perfect square trinomial. And the whole thing can be condensed into a plus b over 2 squared. That's the general formula. Let me show you for this specific example. So if b is 16, the number in front of x, what is b over 2 squared? Well, because of the parentheses, we divide first. 16 divided by 2, 8. And 8 squared is 8 times 8, which gives us 64. For this to be a perfect square trinomial, our c value has to be 64. So to condense this quadratic, we can take x plus 8 squared. Where did 8 come from? It's half of 16. And that is our factored form. Same thing here. B is equal to negative 12. So what is b over 2 squared? Negative 12 divided by 2 is negative 6. If we square that, we get 36. And that's what our c value has to be. For our factored form, this is going to be x plus b over 2 squared. Since b is a negative 12 divided by 2, this becomes x minus 6 squared. For this next problem, we start with our b value, and we identify what b over 2 squared is. b is negative 4. We plug that in. So if we take negative 4 divided by 2 squared, we should get a positive 4. The problem is our c value is negative 5. How can I get from negative 5 to a positive 4? What about if I add 9? Will that work? Remember that when we add 9 to both sides, it's both sides of the equal sign. I have some students trying to add 9 twice over here. On the left, negative 5 plus 9 is 4. And on the right, 0 plus 9 is 9. This is now a perfect square trinomial, so it can be simplified to x minus 2 squared. Then we can take the square root of both sides. On the left, square and square root cancel each other out, and we have x minus 2. And on the right, there are two possible answers, positive 3 or negative 3. To write it quickly, we can use the plus minus symbol. The final step to get x by itself is to add 2 to both sides. So x is going to be equal to 2 plus or minus 3. So 2 plus 3 is 5, and 2 minus 3 is negative 1. And for this problem, those would be the two possible answers. Heading to the right, my b value is negative 10. If I divide that by 2, I get negative 5. And if I square that, I get 25. The problem is, my c value is negative 11. How can I get from negative 11 to a positive 25? I have to add 36. So let's go ahead and do that over here, adding 36 to both sides. This changes the problem to x squared minus 10x plus 25 is equal to 36. This is now a perfect square trinomial, so I can change it to x minus b over 2, which is 5, squared, is equal to 36. And to get x by itself, I can take the square root of both sides. It cancels out the square on the left, and on the right, there are two possible answers, a positive 6 or a negative 6. The final step to get x by itself is to add 5 to both sides. So I have x is equal to 5 plus or minus 6. 5 plus 6 is 11. 5 minus 6 is negative 1. And those are my two possible solutions. As we venture past the problems you need to solve to earn a 2, things get a little bit more complicated. If my b value is negative 22, b over 2 squared is what? half of negative 22 is negative 11. If I square that, I get 121. The factored form is always x minus b over 2 squared. So this is x minus half of negative 22, which is 11 squared. Heading to the right, my b value is negative 8, so b over 2 is negative 4, and if I square that, I will get a positive 16. The problem is, my c value is 17. How do I get from 17 to 16? I subtract 1. So I have to do that to both sides because this is an equation after all. My new equation reads x squared minus 8x plus 16 is equal to 6. I can condense this on the left into x minus 4 squared because half of negative 8 is negative 4. The next step is to take the square root of both sides. On the left, I'm left with x minus 4, and on the right, 6 is not a perfect square. We can make our life simple by writing this as plus or minus the square root of 6. We get x by itself by adding 4 to both sides, and x is equal to 4 plus or minus the square root of 6. And that's our final answer. We don't need to simplify past there. Sometimes the initial setup might look different, but don't worry. We've been manipulating equations all year. To move these to the left, all we have to do is subtract. So we can subtract 20x from both sides, or subtract 50 from both sides. And what we're left with is x squared minus 20x minus 50 is equal to 0. Then the problem continues just like before. What is my b value? It's negative 20. If I cut that in half, I'm at negative 10. If I square it, I'm at 100. The problem is c is equal to negative 50. How can I get from negative 50 to 100? I'm going to have to add 150 to both sides. So let's go ahead and do that. My new equation becomes x squared minus 20x plus 100 is equal to 150. Because this is now a perfect square trinomial, I can condense it to x minus 10 squared is equal to 150. I take the square root of both sides. This becomes x minus 10 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 150. I add 10 to both sides, and my final answer reads x is 10 plus or minus the square root of 150. Next problem, b is negative 6. If I cut that in half, it's negative 3. If I square it, it should be 9. The problem is c is 6. How do I get from 6 to 9? I add 3. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides of the equation. X squared minus 6x plus 9 is equal to 3. I can condense this on the left because it is a perfect square trinomial into x minus 3 squared. I take the square root of both sides. X minus 3 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 3. I add 3 to both sides, and my final answer can be left as x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 3. Things get a little trickier for the 4 section because if I try to take b over 2 squared, notice it's no longer an even number because it's 9 over 2 squared. So what is 4.5 squared? With a little bit of calculator work, you can determine 4.5 squared is 20.25. And the factored form is x plus 4.5 squared. I also would have accepted x plus 9 over 2 squared. Next problem, if our b value is 8, and I divide that by 2, I get 4. And if I square it, I get 16. Of course, my c value is not 16. It's negative 27. How do I get from negative 27 to a positive 16? I have to add 43. So if I do that to both sides, I end up with x squared plus 8x plus 16 is equal to 43. I can condense this to x plus 4 squared is equal to 43. If I take the square root of both sides, I get x plus 4 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 43. The last step is to subtract 4 from both sides. And my final answer is x is negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 43. And the last row, if b is 5, then b over 2 squared is going to be 6.25. And c, we know, is equal to 2. How do I get from 2 to 6.25? I'm going to have to add 4.25 to both sides. If I rewrite my equation, I now have x squared plus 5x plus 6.25 is equal to 4.25. Because this is a perfect square trinomial on the left, I can reduce it to x plus 2.5 squared is equal to 4.25. If I take the square root of both sides, I'm left with x plus 2.5 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 4.25. The final step is to subtract 2.5 from both sides, and I get x is equal to negative 2.5 plus or minus the square root of 4.25. For this last one, my b value is 7. If I cut that in half and square it, I get 12.25. My c value is 0. I could have moved the 21 over, but I chose not to. I just kept it as 0. So to get from 0 to 12.25, I'm going to have to add 12.25 to both sides. This gives me x squared plus 7x plus 12.25 is equal to 33.25. And I can condense this to x plus 3.5 squared is equal to 33.25. The next step is to take the square root of both sides, and I get x plus 3.5 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 33.25. The final step is to subtract 3.5 from both sides, and my final answer reads x is equal to negative 3.5 plus or minus the square root of 33.25.